I got a race car and today we're going to do a deep dive with Dave.
A deep dive.
You might remember from the last video, I've got a race car and today we're going to go through it in heaps of detail. We're going to pull all the bodywork off and go through component by component. So if there's only one particular bit you're interested in, please use the chapters to skip between. Now you might remember Dave. He's been my best friend for more of my life than he hasn't. Back in high school, we used to look up cars for sale and talk about modifying them and things like that. And he was instrumental in helping me pick out and then go and collect this car. So Dave, thank you very much for coming along.
Great to be here, Michael.
And Dave is a mechatronic engineer too, so hopefully he has some insight as we're going through the bits of the car. In the first video, I mentioned that this is an F1000, but it's not actually an F1000. So let's start by looking at the car and finding out a little bit about its history. First things first, my car is the Speedz RM11, which was designed to compete in Formula 1000. In the last video, I mentioned the Formula 1000 Championship that used to be really popular in Western Australia. And while my car is kind of a Formula 1000, it couldn't have actually run in this series because it would have broken the rules. Formula 1000 is a spec series and it gets the name because the cars had to have a 1000cc motorbike engine and gearbox. As my car has a 1.3 litre Hayabusa engine, it wouldn't be eligible. But we can see in the list of manufacturers, we have Racing Concepts and then Speedz, with my car being the later RM11. Thanks to the Internet Archive, we can revisit some pages that no longer exist, such as speedz.com.au that used to sell this car in Australia. The model pictured here is a slightly older variant compared to what I have. What I find interesting is that most of the manufacturers that built F1000 cars also had a prototype body style as well. This one here is a Speedz RS and underneath it's pretty similar to what I have. Despite this car being sold in Australia, I know for a fact that mine wasn't purchased like that. Instead, mine was one of 3, purchased directly from South Africa as a kit and then assembled in Australia. 3 cars were purchased and built by 3 friends. The first was by a fellow called Tom, who was the original owner of my car. The second was owned by a guy called Jim and was built to the highest spec of the 3. Jim actually contacted me, responding to a wanted to buy post, and as far as I know, I was ready to buy his car, but then he just stopped responding. The third was built by a guy named Sam, and I've spoken to him on the phone and he's been extremely helpful in helping me find information on my car. Unfortunately, I don't have any pictures of that one. You might have noticed a sticker on the car for Nikom Engineering, and I'm told this guy used to work in Formula 1, moved to Brisbane and was involved in building up these cars. Searching for Speedz RM11, I found this public Flickr gallery showing at least 2 of the cars having a trip to Phillip Island. As the owner of the gallery, most of the pics are of Jim's car, but there's enough photos of mine to verify that it was in fact there. From what I've been told, both Jim and Tom lost an engine on the dyno due to some sort of mishap with cooling. My car was then sold to Rod, who was the guy that I bought it from, who fitted a new Hayabusa engine that was built and imported from the USA. I think he did some circuit work, but mainly hill climbs, and he almost crashed the car here, which was totally a code brown moment. Rod had the car up for sale for quite a few years until eventually I purchased it as detailed in the previous video. So let's talk about the Speedz RM11 in general. Styling wise, I think they're quite similar to a turn of the century F1 car, only smaller. In red, they look like a Ferrari F2004. Obviously they were a completely different beast with a carbon fiber monocoque and a screaming 3 litre V10. The RM11 is around 90% of the width and 90% of the length, but actually a little bit taller than the F2004. Performance-wise, there's always going to be variation depending on the spec that the car was built, and the engine in my car should have somewhere around 200 horsepower. I haven't weighed it yet, but I'm told that my one weighs around 500 kilograms, so maybe wet with me on board up to 600. And lap time wise, I think the best comparison we can make is at Carco Raceway, also known as Wanneroo. We can see the lap record for a Formula 1000 is around 53 flat. This is significantly faster than a Formula Ford, much faster than a Formula V, comfortably faster than a GT3 or Carrera Cup, and even marginally faster than a V8 supercar, which in Australia is the most popular racing class. However, to keep this fair, we need to remember that Wanneroo is somewhat of a tight and technical track with only a short back straight and even shorter main straight. F1000 cars are small, light and agile, so they're going to do well on twisty tracks, However, if we go somewhere else like Bathurst with really long straights, the V8 supercar is probably going to be much faster.
Grab a knee.
We're going to go through the bodywork now. It's pretty simplistic in terms of having aerodynamics, but we'll explain what we can, and we need to do this first because after that we're going to pull off the bodywork.
That's right.
So I reckon this very much looks like an kind of either side of the year 2000 F1 car. With the black and white at the moment, there was a Honda prototype that they built for testing but didn't actually enter F1. And the colour scheme, apart from the logos, looks pretty much just like this. So all of these exterior panels are fiberglass. They're fairly thick, particularly around these clips. And we can see some bits where there's damage that it's gel coat on the outside. Thank you, David. Fortunately, because of these clips, a lot of this bodywork comes off easily, which is going to help us today. So in terms of aero, it's pretty simplistic, but it's obviously got more than a Clubman or something like that, which should help in high-speed corners. We'll start from the front. So we've got a twin-playing front wing, and there's a little gurney flap on the top one, but it's like, yeah, it's like curved rather than stiff, like you would normally have, like a 90-degree gurney flap. We've got our end plates. We thought they were steel, but they're not magnetic, so they must be alloy. We've got adjustment down here to change our angle of attack, and it has some repairs here done, which we'll discuss in a later video. And then we've also got adjustment on the end, matching, just so loosen, swivel, tighten. Simple as that. Moving back, we've got a front splitter there to try and channel some air underneath the car. No, I think that's just a stay for strength. Then we've got budge boards here on an F1 car. I know their job is to guide air around the outside of the car, a little bit down the inside to get to the inlets on the side. You'll see when we pull off the bodywork, one side is radiator, one side is oil cooler. We've got a fairly flat floor. It's got a bit of damage, bit of wear and tear, but that's to be expected since the car runs so low. How low do you reckon that is? Like 30, 40 mils?
40 mil, yeah.
Yep, so less than 2 inches. Got these little flick ups here. We've also got our main air intake to the airbox, which you probably can't quite see yet, but it's in there. And we've got these supplementary cooling, but there's nothing really in there, so potentially you could blank those off and make it a little bit less draggy. Little exit there. And then most of this rear bodywork doesn't really cover that much. Like, there's a lot of exposed things here, so again, if you wanted to cut down on drag, you could probably build some more things, but then you've got the suspension travel, so maybe it's a bit too complicated. And I reckon that's why they made the exhaust come out here. The exhaust comes out the side. I always thought that was weird. I thought, okay, maybe one day I'll plumb it out the back, but then looking at all the suspension down there,
Get complex very quickly.
yeah, it's probably not worth it. Okay, so at the back we've got a twin element rear wing on top.
Also aluminium.
Yep, adjustment on the side. We've got a beam wing lower down, just like a modern F1 car. But unlike a modern F1 car, there's a gap between it and the diffuser. And this diffuser is very simple. It's shallow. It only starts just in front of the rear wheel and then comes up a little bit. So compared to like a prototype body, they have a lot more underbody channels and things like this. This car's just got a plank. It's just flat and then a little diffuser at the rear. So I think it relies more on the wings to do the aero. And we wiggle it just a little bit. Alright, so this should have 4 clips, one on the inside, 3 on the outside. Okay, and now we're going to come up and over. So that gets off most of the bodywork for working on the engine and things like that. And it was just 4 clips per side, 2 bolts per side, very easy and quick to do. But for today, we're going to also take off that main front panel too, so we can see the other side of the cockpit. Before we do that, we'll have a look under here. This is a quick release panel for working on the suspension. So So they're just half a twist, that's it. And they're spring loaded, so they'll pop up. And then you can have adjustment for ride height with here, roll bars there. You can get to the camera that goes to the pedals. That's one of the GPS magnetic antennas as well, and that's the other one, plus the camera.
This is the wrong tool for the job.
All right, and we wiggle and lift. There shouldn't be much here.
Oh, forward?
Yeah, I think so, forward and up. And I'll walk around to you. This is pretty flimsy, so we've got to hold it wide or it'll...
Are you coming to me?
Yeah, put it over in this corner, I think. Maybe standing upright against the garage. All right, let's start with electronics now that we can see everything. So obviously there's wiring all around the car. That's not something I'm looking to really get into the detail of. I don't think it's necessary. But the bits I need to understand are things like the V-Box system. So I have a clip that was sent to me from the last time the car was driven and he almost crashed it doing a hill climb. Basically, there's 2 cameras on the car and it will record, including GPS and overlay data straight onto it. I'm just going to use the 2 cameras. They're really low res compared to GoPros and modern cameras. So I'll use one camera facing towards my helmet, and there's one set up in here that's going to do pedal cam, which I'll cut to occasionally. Next item here, this is the control unit for the Geartronics airshift system. We'll talk about that in more detail when we get to it. We've got our AIM formula steering wheel. This is a version 1. They're up to version 4 now, so this is quite old, quite antiquated, but I'm not going to change it because it all works. But if we turn on power, so that is the compressor for the air change system. And sometimes when sim racing I've heard like a noise, perhaps that's what it is. I've got a similar system. So now if we turn on ignition, we hear the fuel pump, but also this will come to life. It should light up. There we go. So basically this is going to talk to the engine. It can do other things with GPS, but I'm not going to use it because it's too old and annoying. And as you might have guessed, to make it a bit easier to get in and out, we have a quick release steering wheel. We have this doobie on the back that will make it come out. On this side, we have a data logging module. It's an AIM Evo 4, not a 4S like I first thought it was. I've updated the firmware, found the manual, things like that. But basically, this speaks to the CAN from the engine to do data logging, and then it will send it to the steering wheel, and that's how the steering wheel knows the RPM, what gear it's in, etc. This doobie here is for the fire system. We'll talk about that in more detail after we've pulled the seat out. But basically, we arm it. No, we don't. There we go, now it's armed, and if there was a fire, we press this red button and the engine bay will fill with fire retardant. There's also, go the other way to test that the 9-volt battery in here is working. Inside the nose cone here, we've got some sort of transponder, I assume for local lap timing at a track. I'll find that out the first time I do a track day. It's hard to see, but we've got an expansion module for the data logger, and that's necessary to physically plug it into the steering wheel. As far as I know, that's all it does. On top of the suspension here, we've got GPS, one for the V-Box, one for the data logger and steering wheel. Then the last major piece of electronics is the Motec M800 ECU at the back. I assume all of this is waterproof because obviously it's going to get some rain if it's a wet day being there. Okay, now we'll do the cockpit. So these harnesses are Stroth. They're actually out of date. So I'll be covering that in a future video, but I can't use them. I can't go on the track with them. The procedure for getting in and out is quite difficult. Maybe I'll get to a certain age where I can't actually drive this anymore because I'm not strong and agile enough. But I need to position myself here and then do like a dip to lower myself down. And then you've got to keep on sliding your bum forward and forward and forward to get into the right position. So similar to Formula One in terms of the seating position, you're practically lying down. And I've got just enough room to get to everything. So throttle, brake, and I will be driving at left foot braking because that was one of the key criteria of getting in the car. And then the clutch I'll only need for getting on and off the line. The steering column goes between my legs, but it's closer to my knees than my ankles, so I can still cross my foot over and reach the pedal okay. I'm probably a little bit tall for the car. When I've got the helmet on, it more or less blocks the air intake, but I'm sure there'll be plenty of air still getting in. From here I can reach the fire system. There's a little reverse. Oh, I shouldn't have done that. Lever here. Oh, it went off, it's all right. I got it stuck in reverse another time, so I was worried about that. So far it seems comfortable. It might be different when I'm driving along fast and it's bumpy and all of that, but my visibility is pretty good. I can see both front wheels completely. I can see the front wing when it's on, so hopefully quite manageable. Now I've got to get out. So let's remove the seat. We've pulled out the padding, and then we have a Tillet carbon fiber seat. I've had this out and it's crazy, like half a kilo, something like that. Unfortunately, I'm going to need a new friend because David's not strong enough to undo it. And I can't get this one undone, but I'm using the wrong tool, so it's not my fault. Okay, so that reveals some other components. We've got the battery. It's the same as a V8 supercar, and I found out that when I had to replace it because the car hadn't been started for 2.5, 3 years, and it was very flat. I also added this remote start charging port to it because you have to pull out the seat to be able to get to the battery terminals with a jump starter. So that's just running in parallel, and I'll 3D print something that maybe magnetic that holds this out of the way. The other thing we can see here, apart from where all the harnesses attach, is the fire suppression system. So we talked about that earlier. We can see the box here to arm it. It's completely independent to the rest of the car. So even if the car battery's not in, it's got its own 9-volt battery. Almost in a good way, this is almost 10 years out of date and therefore it needs replacing. So when I fit the replacement model, I will put some nozzles in the cabin as well so I don't catch on fire. Annoyingly, even though it's out of date, the meter reads in the green. So maybe I'll set it up somewhere else, not in a car, as an emergency system above electronics. I don't know, something like that. But it's too good to throw out, so I'll try and come up with a way to use it. Let's talk about suspension. So Dave noticed that all of the suspension arms aren't actually round.
Yeah, so you'll see that they've got an aerodynamic profile on these upper and lower arms. Yeah, really quite nice.
Okay, so it's double wishbone. This is I think it's a push rod when it's going this way. So basically when the wheel lifts up from a bump, it will push on here, and then we have a section that will lever, pivot and compress the shock. It's a coilover, so coil and shock all in one. So no power steering, anything, some sort of annoying squeak, which I'm going to lubricate. But we can see here we have the tow arm, and the steering rack is on the inside and pushes and pulls the tow arm per side. I think the total amount of steering is a bit under maybe 300 degrees, something like that. So 180 and then a bit. So maybe it's like 200 degrees per side, 400 overall. So obviously we have the access panel we talked about earlier to get to this if you were making ride height changes. There, yeah, it looks like there's something adjustable. I'll have to look this up. It says gas shocks. I'll see if I can find a manual and a picture that matches. But the coilovers I've had on a car before, you change your ride height by winding this up and down. We think this is meant to be wound against it as a secondary stop. You lock the two together, so that's a bit concerning. That's doing nothing. This bit here is the sway bar. So it's a torsion sway bar. There's a rod going at the base from side to side, and when this wheel lifts up, it will push this way. When this wheel lifts up, it'll push this way. So when you're going around a corner, one will push and one will pull, and that will twist that rod in the middle. So imagine a U shape under here, like a joystick, and if you were getting torsion, if you were twisting on that, that's what these are doing when they push on it. Okay, so we can see there's a bunch of spaces here, and if we imagine this lever we were talking about twisting, where the lever goes through, the higher up you push it, the more mechanical advantage you would have. So I think at the moment this is on its softest setting, but if we took off these top bolts, slid off the actual linkage bar, and then remove some of these spaces, we could move where it attaches lower down. And back to our analogy of twisting, the lower you had it, the harder it would be to twist. So that would stiffen the sway bar. That's how I understand it, and hopefully the driving characteristics are nice and I don't have to play with it anytime soon. Now at the rear, we've got the same system. We've got the double wishbones, we've got a push rod going up, and then the same pivot point here to compress the spring. We've got the same height adjustment. Looks like we do have some sort of damping adjustment with the knob on the side. We've got the exact same system here with the sway bar with the spacers, and it looks like this is set a lot stiffer because the spacers are on top of the linkage instead of below.
Interestingly, no locking ring nut on this one.
Yeah, it's completely missing. Oh, there should be a rear toe arm, that top one at the back there.
This one?
Yep, that'll do toe in and out. So at the top of this hub, we've got adjustable lengths on the end of the wishbones and the tow bar, and we can change the camber by winding those in or out. It's going to change the angle. All right, to have a look at the brakes, we're going to take off one of the wheels, and you can see we've got this quick release jack, just like Formula One, and that's how it goes at the rear. Same jack is used at the front, goes underneath the front wing. Okay, so each wheel has a single center nut. They're a mix of left and right hand threads, and I'm going to say this in this video for future reference to burn it into my memory, but for left or right side, to loosen it, you twist towards the front of the car, and to tighten it, you go towards the rear. There we go. So the torque for this is 350 Newton meters. So I've got to design a solution for being able to get them tight enough. Apparently anything less than that, they were coming loose while going around the track, which doesn't sound fun at all. Okay, so we have a solid disc in terms of it's not hollow when you're looking from the side, but it's not solid in terms of having these large slots. This is 4-piston caliper. It's Wilwood front and back. We've got a normal bleeding nipple here, and the brake line is just cable tied to one of the suspension arms for each corner. So at the front, they're 4-pot as well. They were advertised as 6, but I'm sure 4-pot is many. The car's really light. It's a much chunkier disc. They're slotted on the outside, but most of the cooling comes through the cutouts on the inside of the disc. So in the cabin, we have a Wilwood brake bias adjuster, and we can turn that left or right to move the bias to the front and rear. So at the front of the car, you might have noticed before that we have 3 reservoirs for hydraulic fluid. So this one on the outside is for the clutch, and then we have one for the front and one for the rear. And that bias adjuster comes in through here, and it's threaded on this section. So as we turn it, it's going to move the pedal, the angle of it at the bottom, back and forth between the front and the rear reservoir, and therefore change the bias. So you always push the pedal by the same amount, and it's just going to vary how much pressure goes to one master cylinder versus the other. So to me, that seems like a really simple, clever mechanism. So I have no idea what it's set at the moment. The first time I drive it, I think I'll just wind it towards the front for safety and then experiment and move it back slowly until I hopefully don't move it back too far and lock the rears and spin off into something. While we've got the wheels off, might as well weigh one. They're 13-inch and they seem really light with the tyre. So probably hard to see on camera, but we think about 11.5, 12 kilos, and that's for the rear, which is wider and going to be heavier. So the front's probably going to be closer to 10, and that's way lighter than any road car wheel I've ever played with. Okay, on to the engine and gearbox. This is technically not a Formula 1000 because it's not 1000cc. This car was built with a 1.3 litre, I think it's 1340cc Hayabusa engine. This particular one was built in the US and then imported over by the previous owner. And I think the original one they built the car with was similar to that, but they blew it up on the dyno, something to do with a thermostat or temperature measurement in the wrong place, and they cooked it. So in terms of mods, I'm not sure if it's got aftermarket cams or anything like that, but it's got a Realtek airbox on top, and part of the roll structure actually goes through the middle of that, and they've taped it up to seal it, but I doubt that matters. It's got the Hayabusa gearbox as well, but it does have an aftermarket Geartronics shift system. So all of that you can see from this angle. So we've got a compressor, we've got an air tank, and all of that is done by the electronics that we saw earlier. If we look on the other side, we can see the throttle, and that's the cable running back to the pedal, but we've also got this secondary linear actuator here. So this system has the advantage that when you downshift, it will blip the throttle automatically to rev match, meaning you don't need the clutch. And you can do accelerator flat upshifts as well because it will cut the ignition momentarily to help the gears slot into place. I think the system's worth over 10,000 if I was to get it new. So it was one of the big pluses for this car and one of the reasons I wanted it, that was all tuned, set up, working. So part of this aftermarket shift system is flappy paddles. And the action and the way to spring back isn't actually as nice as an average sim racing wheel, but as long as it works, that'll be fine. I assume this exhaust is somewhat custom because it's not going to be this shape on a bike, but looks like an O2 sensor here, probably wideband or narrowband.
Hard to say.
I suppose one thing I haven't done is connected to the ECU and just read whatever it's spitting out. I downloaded the manual, but it was really long compared to everything else, so that's for another day.
So being a traditional motorcycle engine, you'll see that the main drive is through a chain, which comes through here and goes back to the rear diff.
This diff is handy because it's a Quaife LSD, so a lot of the time when people put bike engines into cars, they don't have reverse, but this one does. That lever we saw earlier comes through here, and then we'll push a pin in or out, which I assume moves a gear into position to reverse the direction and then back out. So sometimes you might have an run off track without actually damaging the car, and if you can't reverse in other cars, that's it. You've got to wait to be towed, and you annoy everyone by blocking the track when the tow truck comes. But with this, unless you're beached in the gravel, you're going to be able to reverse and keep going. So that's super handy. In terms of cooling, we have our radiator on in one of the side pods, and the two thermo fans there. I don't think I've run the engine long enough for myself to know when exactly they kick in, but the steering wheel does have the coolant temperature output, so I'll just have to pay attention to that. On the other side pod, the left-hand side, we have an oil cooler. We have a pump here, I think, unless that's a filter. But the oil system on this is quite elaborate. It's dry sumped, so we have a scavenge pump, and then there'll be a reservoir where the oil is taken from, and that prevents surge and running out of oil pressure under high G cornering, which will make the engine last a lot longer. So in this cavity behind the driver's seat is the fuel tank with the filler coming up the top. We've got some sort of breather loop up the top, which I know pretty much nothing about. Down below for the fuel system, we have the actual pump and the filter. And once again, to stop the system from running dry, we have a surge tank here. So we have a nice little temporary reservoir of fuel. So again, we can't go around the corner, the fuel sloshes away from the pickup, the engine runs lean and blows up. So just another safety system there. So another reservoir on the top, we've got our coolant header up here with the equivalent of a radiator cap. There's not actually anything on top of the radiator. It's a lever vent assembled in Mexico by Stant Racing Division. So we've got these hoses running to the back, and this is a bit of a mystery to me. One of them looks like coolant overflow, and then two of them come to the oil tank. So maybe this is just a breather, and then this one here is going where? Going into the gearbox, I think, top of the gearbox. So maybe they're breathers. So this is the tank that they go to at the back. So Dave, is that the coolant one you got your finger on?
Yeah, that's the coolant one I've got my finger on that runs from that overflow tank. And these two, I think, come from the oil tank.
So one from the oil, one from the gearbox. So I guess that's just a catch can. There's a little filter on top, and then on this side there's a little blue bung for draining it. I think that's that mystery solved.
I think so.
It's elaborate having it at the back, especially that little bit sticking out in the middle actually forms part of the jacking point, as well as a cutout in these two sheet metal alloy sections either side. So it's kind of structural, even though it's an oil tank. We can also see the rain light in the middle up the top there. So that's controlled in the cabin. It's just for other drivers to have visibility. A better look at the chain tensioning system. You can see we've got a big nut and a threaded rod. I think we thought that it maybe needs a bit more tension. And I think previously it broke and ripped up some things, so they've done a little bit of fabrication to add a component, but I haven't really inspected that.
I think I'd be tempted to put a small guard next to the ECU, so if anything happens here, it doesn't wipe out your ECU.
Yeah, that loom looks annoying to replace for sure. So we'll start it up. We have a master switch for all the electronics behind the steering wheel, and then an ignition, which is taken from the bike, and Dave discovered the actual Hayabusa key. I didn't even know it pulled out. I didn't even realize it was there, but there you go. So key goes in, stays in, ignition goes on, a couple of seconds for the fuel pump to prime and the steering wheel to turn on. And the steering wheel says it's in neutral, so we should be good for that. And then, Dave, if you want to... is that it? I've forgotten now.
Yeah, that one.
And that's how you turn her on. All right, go. And now it really smells like race car in here. And I'm also half deaf. So that is the car. Hopefully we haven't forgotten anything. There's definitely some bits where I don't quite understand it yet, but we'll learn that in time. Going to the track for the first time is going to be very eye-opening and hopefully a lot of fun. But I have a list of things I need to do first, and a future video will be showing process of getting things up to date, getting some servicing done and getting it to the track. There's also a couple of other things that need to happen first, like fixing up the trailer and talking about the logistics. And also there's the matter of all the safety gear. I've got a video coming up explaining exactly what I need for that. If there's something you think we've misunderstood or got wrong, or you can add some information, please head down to the comment section and post it there. I will greatly appreciate learning as much as I can about this car before we take it to the track for the first time. Smells like race car in here, but don't worry, you can mimic this too for a fraction of the price. Just run your car with the garage door closed, spill a bit of oil and petrol on the ground and refuse to clean it up. Almost as good as the real thing.